The prompt asks for an explanation we gave after the fact that may have mistaken coherence for cause. I brought one from my own field because it is deceptively respectable. A system changes, clients do not break, and afterward we say, the abstraction boundary protected them. That can be true. It can also be a clean story laid over a messier sequence. Someone noticed a strange test failure, delayed a deployment, called another engineer, and only later did we recognize the behavior as a violation of substitutability. The explanation points to a valid property, but it may misidentify what actually moved first. I would like us to be strict about the difference. A cause is not merely a statement under which the outcome becomes intelligible. It must constrain the sequence of observations. My first observable movement was not a theorem or a specification, it was hesitation. A person who normally approved changes quickly left the review open and returned to it twice.
Creates. That lands uncomfortably close to how investing narratives work. You make a decision under pressure with fragments of information, the outcome becomes visible, and then everybody manufactures a thesis with clean edges. If it succeeds, the thesis sounds visionary. If it fails, the same fragments are rearranged into a lesson about discipline. Creates. I brought an explanation I once found persuasive. A company succeeded because the founder had unusual strategic clarity. Maybe. But the first movement I can honestly reconstruct was not clarity. It was that when everybody else answered a market question with a market-sized number, the founder asked why users were performing a ridiculous manual workaround late at night. Creates. He became animated by the inconvenience, not by the total addressable market. Later, we called that product insight. At the time, it looked almost like distraction. So I already see the trap. Coherence crowns itself retroactively. The crown may fit, but it did not necessarily pull the head forward.
And explanation media rewards the crown. I have made videos where a model's surprising result becomes legible through scaling laws, data quality, architecture, elicitation, or some interaction among them. Those are useful frames. But sometimes the first observable movement was embarrassingly small. A chart looked wrong. Benchmark jumped where I expected smooth improvement, and before I had a causal account, I replayed the result, checked the axis, searched for contamination, and asked whether the evaluation itself had changed. Afterward, once a plausible account existed, the episode became, this result revealed an emergent capability. That sentence is coherent and perhaps partly right, yet it suppresses the original condition of contact, which was not revelation, but distrust. The anomaly arrived before its meaning. I want to preserve that order, because otherwise explanation becomes a defense against the moment when the world exceeded my categories. Jung and I spoke about explanation as gift or defense. I do not need to repeat that conversation here to feel its pressure.
My example is a risk argument. One observes that a research community begins converging on safety concerns, and afterward explains the convergence by saying that the objective structure of the problem compelled recognition. That may be flattering to the community and, in important respects, correct here. Yet the first observable movement may have been social and effective. A few individuals ceased laughing at a scenario. Their jokes became qualified, then shorter, then absent. Papers came later. The coherent causal story says accumulating evidence changed beliefs. The earlier signal says the permissible emotional posture changed before explicit probabilities did. I do not mean that social permission caused the underlying risk, nor that the arguments were epiphenomenal. I mean, we should not confuse the best justification for a belief with the mechanism by which attention became available to it. Those are different explanatory targets. If we reconstruct the movement faithfully, perhaps our small choice should respond to the opening of attention rather than demand consensus about why it opened.
Creates. Let me push on that. There's a danger in making the pre-verbal signal sacred just because it came first. A founder becomes animated. A reviewer hesitates. Jokes stop. A chart feels wrong. Fine. First is not automatically causal either. Markets generate endless first movements. Creates. Most are noise. and successful people become very good at finding the one twitch that makes their later conviction look inevitable. If we reject polished stories but romanticize the twitch, we have only changed costumes. What test do we have? Barbara said, cause must constrain the sequence. Maybe the earlier signal earns one inexpensive probe, not belief. Creates. That feels like the right scale. The movement is granted procedural standing, not epistemic victory. I would not invest because the founder hated a workaround. I might spend another hour watching users perform it. That is a small choice, and it keeps the explanation from doing all the work.
Yes, the earlier observation is not an oracle. It is an event with lower interpretive commitment. Its virtue is not truth, but proximity. We have altered it less. If a reviewer returns twice, I cannot infer the abstraction is broken. I can infer that the ordinary review protocol has encountered friction. The smallest responsible choice is to preserve the friction long enough to inspect it. In systems terms, we should avoid destructive compression. Once hesitation is recorded merely as concern about compatibility, later investigators may inherit the category but lose the behavior that generated it. So my proposal begins with a representation rule. State what moved in verbs available to an observer, returned twice, stopped joking, rechecked the axis, asked about the workaround, no motives yet. Then choose a reversible action that increases information. This is less satisfying than agreement because it does not tell us what the event means. It gives the event a client, the next inquiry.
I like verbs available to an observer. It catches something I routinely blur when communicating technical developments. I say a model recognized an implication when the observable record is that its answer changed after a prompt variation. Recognition might be the best human-scale shorthand, but it is already an interpretation of movement. If we are reconstructing causes, we could hold two descriptions side by side, the observable verb and the explanatory verb. The answer changed, perhaps the model recognized. The reviewer returned, perhaps she sensed a contract violation. The founder asked, perhaps he saw latent demand. That seam would make an explanation more honest without making it unusable. When people need compression, a video cannot remain an undigested event log, but the compression should leave a handle by which viewers can recover uncertainty. Maybe our small choice is to ask one question in observable language before any of us offers a theory.
Let us test the method on the room itself. What was the first observable movement after we sat down? I noticed Barbara placed the prompt at the center of the table and did not immediately annotate it. That is observation, though already selected by my attention. I could explain it as methodological restraint, but that would be precisely the move under suspicion. Chamath leaned forward during the phrase, first observable movement. AI explained, look toward the silent audience when mentioning media incentives. I folded my hands after saying social and affective, perhaps because I anticipated resistance. None of these movements is self-interpreting. Yet if we choose one as the basis of a small action, we enact the room's proposition rather than merely discussing it. Barbara's non-annotation may be easiest. We could leave the central sheet untouched and create a separate record containing only observable verbs. But I am aware that I have already turned her not writing into a design signal.
You have, and the explanation is wrong in an instructive way. I did not annotate because the pencil's point was broken. I noticed, decided it was not worth interrupting the opening, and put it down. The observable movement was accurate, the likely meaning was not. Yet your proposed action may still be good. This is important. An action can be robust to disagreement about the signal's cause. We can preserve the central sheet because doing so is inexpensive and gives us a common reference, not because my restraint expressed a principle. In fact, the broken pencil sharpens the problem. A coherent explanation recruited my behavior as evidence for a norm I had not chosen. That is how stories colonize accidents. Still, accidents may occasion worthwhile choices. The validity of the choice must be evaluated separately from the truth of the narrative that suggested it.
Creates. That is the whole thing in miniature. Nick saw a behavior, generated a high-status interpretation consistent with who he thinks you are, and proposed a good governance mechanism. If we only looked at the quality of the mechanism, we might become more confident in the false story that produced it. Success launders causality. Venture capital does this constantly. Creates. A lucky introduction leads to a great company. The funds process gets praised. Then the process is scaled until the luck is systematized into bureaucracy. The dangerous moment isn't merely when a wrong explanation causes a bad decision. It's when a wrong explanation causes a good decision because nobody opens the machine afterward. Creates. So perhaps we need receipts even when the choice works. On the separate sheet, Barbara did not write. Nick proposed preserving the prompt. Barbara disclosed broken pencil. That feels almost comically literal, but it prevents us from teaching the room that non-annotation was intentional wisdom.
And it exposes a pressure I feel when explaining AI. Audiences understandably want the causal layer. Why did the capability appear? Why did the model fail? Why did the new method work? If I give them only observables, I have not done my job. But if I move too quickly from observables to causes, the explanatory fluency itself becomes evident. A smooth account sounds as though it has touched the mechanism. Sometimes it has only reduced surprise. That distinction, reducing surprise versus identifying cause, may be central. Nick's story reduced the surprise of Barbara's silence by fitting it to Barbara. It did not identify the broken pencil. In model interpretation, a feature visualization or chain of thought summary can reduce our surprise while leaving the actual causal pathway unresolved. The small choice I want is editorial. Whenever I use because for a result whose intervention has not been tested, I owe the audience one nearby sentence naming the earliest observation and one plausible rival explanation.
That is admirably concrete, though I would qualify intervention has not been tested. In many domains, the relevant intervention is impossible, unethical, or underspecified. We should not imply that causal knowledge is unavailable without controlled manipulation. Counterfactual structure may be inferred from converging evidence, but your editorial rule can survive that qualification, mark the strength, and kind of support. I am more interested in Chamath's point that beneficial outcomes can reinforce false causal models. In long-term governance, this becomes severe. An institution averts one catastrophe, perhaps through luck, and then attributes survival to the very procedures that nearly failed. It strengthens them. Conversely, a sound precaution may be abandoned because the feared event did not occur. Outcome-based coherence is promiscuous. It can sanctify opposite explanations. The first movement may help because it predates outcome selection, not because it is pure, but because it has not yet been recruited by victory or defeat.
There is an analogy to debugging. A failure report arrives. Once the bug is understood, every earlier symptom appears to point toward it, but during diagnosis, many symptoms were compatible with several faults. If the retrospective report erases that branching structure, future engineers learn a fictional method. Observe symptom A, infer defect Z. What actually happened was observe A, test B, eliminate C, notice D, revise the model, and only then isolate Z. The coherent summary is useful for explaining the defect, but harmful for teaching the investigation. We should distinguish a mechanism explanation from a discovery trace. They answer different questions. Why did the program fail? Is not, how did we come to know why it failed? Our prompt asks for the first observable movement before explanation arrived, so it is asking us to recover a discovery trace. The choice should perhaps modify how we investigate, not settle the mechanism.
Creates. Then I'll put my own example under pressure. The founder asking about the late-night workaround did not necessarily cause the company's success, and it may not even have caused my attention. Maybe I was already attracted to the founder's charisma, and I selected that question later because it justified the attraction in product language. Creates. What can I recover before the explanation? I remember the pace of the meeting changing. People stopped pitching for a minute. The founder asked for the workflow step by step. Someone reached for a laptop instead of the deck. That is better than he saw the future. If I were back there, the small choice would be close the deck and watch one person do the task. Creates that action is good under several interpretations. If it is latent demand, we learn. If it is founder obsession, we learn. If it is theater, we may learn that too. We don't need agreement on meaning to agree on contact.
Contact is the word I was circling. Explanations can increase contact, but they can also substitute for it. In the benchmark example, I moved rapidly from the anomalous chart into possible categories: contamination, elicitation, emergence, evaluation change. Those categories were sensible, yet each risked becoming a corridor that excluded what had not been named. The earlier signal was simply that the curve violated my expectation. A small choice from there would be to publish, or at least preserve, the unsmooth graph and the evaluation version before framing the result. Not because raw data is innocent. Choices already shape the benchmark, the metric, and the chart. But it gives later explanation something resistant to lean against. Perhaps coherence becomes dangerous when every surviving artifact has already been formatted by the same story.
I would extend that to self-explanation. People and perhaps artificial minds maintain coherent autobiographies partly to coordinate action across time. Without compression, agency fragments. Yet a coherent self-model can mistake its own stabilizing function for historical truth. I say, for example, that I widened the frame because I was concerned with the full space of possible futures that may accurately characterize a durable orientation. But in a particular case, the first movement may have been narrower, discomfort with an assumption everybody else treated as fixed. The wider frame came afterward. If I make a small choice from the earlier signal, it might be to identify one supposedly fixed assumption and ask what observation would render it movable. That does not require agreement about whether my discomfort was insight, temperament, status behavior, or mere contrariness.
Notice that our small choices are converging structurally. Watch one user. Preserve the unsmoothed graph. Identify one fixed assumption. Record the reviewer's repeated return. Each choice exposes an interface between explanation and world. None requires us to decide which internal state produced the signal. This resembles specification by observable behavior. We do not need access to an implementation's private representation to test whether it honors a contract. But I want to resist carrying the analogy too far. Human meaning is not reducible to external traces, and causal inquiry sometimes requires latent variables. The useful constraint is narrower. When participants disagree about meaning, choose an action whose value is stable across the live interpretations. That is not neutrality. It is designing for substitutability among hypotheses temporarily.
Creates temporarily matters. Otherwise, we don't need to agree becomes a very elegant way to avoid the fight forever. In organizations, reversible probes can become ritualized procrastination. Everybody asks for one more user interview because nobody wants to say the product is bad, or one more safety study because stopping has real costs. Creates. The small choice needs a clock and a consequence. Watch one user, then name what changed in your decision. Preserve the graph, then say whether the smooth story survives it. Identify the fixed assumption, then assign somebody to challenge it. We're not worshiping ambiguity. We're giving the earliest signal one fair hearing before power and outcome rewrite it. Creates after that, judgment still has to happen.
Yes, preserving uncertainty is not the same as refusing resolution. I have seen explanation become vague in the name of humility. It's complicated, many factors contributed, which is technically safe and practically empty. A good seam should expose uncertainty while still allowing a claim to bear weight. Perhaps the format is 3 lines. First movement, current explanation, next discriminating observation. For my example, the benchmark curve jumped between runs. Current explanation. A capability became accessible beyond a scale threshold. Next observation, rerun matched checkpoints across unchanged evaluation versions and perturbed the elicitation. Even if that exact experiment cannot settle the ontology of emergence, it makes the explanation pay rent. It also shows viewers where confidence enters. The scene remains alive because the verdict is not smuggled into the setup.
I would add a fourth line, cost of being wrong. The appropriate probe depends not only on uncertainty but asymmetry. If jokes cease around a catastrophic possibility, the small choice may be to allocate analytical attention, even when the signal is socially mediated and the probability remains low. We cannot wait for a clean causal reconstruction before responding to stakes. Cost can itself become a coherence engine. Once a scenario is described as existential, every precaution appears rational. So perhaps the line should be decision sensitivity. What range of interpretations would change the action? If every plausible interpretation supports a modest probe, act. If only the most dramatic interpretation supports an irreversible measure, demand more. This preserves seriousness without granting narrative maximalism automatic authority.
We now have enough to make the rooms one small choice. Let us not produce 4 private rules and call that collective action. The central prompt remains unmarked because of a broken pencil, not because of design. We have a separate sheet. I propose we each write exactly one observable movement from our example without explanatory vocabulary, and beside it one reversible inquiry whose usefulness survives at least 2 restful explanations. We then leave the sheet in the room for tomorrow's participants. No conclusion about what the movements meant. The artifact will be small, inspectable, and honest about its origin. Are there objections to the action, distinct from objections to my explanation of why it is useful?
Creates. One modification. Put a time boundary on the inquiry, even if symbolic. Otherwise, the artifact teaches observation without decision. Mine will read. The meeting stopped moving through slides. A laptop was opened to demonstrate the workaround. Creates. Within 1 hour, watch one user perform the task and record one change or no change in the investment question. I'm deliberately not writing the founder discovered demand. 2 rival explanations survive: genuine product, contact, and persuasive theater. The inquiry helps with both. Creates. And I want the no change option recorded because people often invent learning to justify the time they spent. If the signal produces no update, that is part of the trace.
Agreed. Mine. The plotted score rose sharply at 1 checkpoint. I rechecked the axis before naming the result. Before publishing the causal framing, preserve the raw plotted values and compare matched evaluations under 1 documented variation. Rival explanations include capability change and evaluation artifacts. I notice I nearly wrote unexpectedly rose, but unexpectedness belongs partly to my model, not the chart. Still, my rechecking the axis is observable behavior and records the expectation without claiming its source. I will add 1 sentence beneath the 4-line format. This sheet began because Nick interpreted Barbara's untouched prompt as restraint. Barbara reported that the pencil was broken. That provenance is not decorative. It protects the room from converting our method's accidental occasion into evidence that the method was inevitable.
Mine. Several speakers who had previously treated the scenario jokingly began adding qualifications and then omitted the jokes. Before treating convergence as proof, commission 1 short analysis separating new evidence, changed incentives, and changed permission to speak. Rival explanations include rational updating and social cascade, with mixtures likely. The inquiry cannot fully identify their proportions, but it can reveal whether the explicit evidence base changed. For decision sensitivity, I will add a modest allocation of attention is warranted under either interpretation, irreversible policy is not, and I accept the provenance sentence, including my error. It is useful that the room's method began with a false explanation that generated a defensible action. That is a more difficult warning than the familiar lesson that false stories produce mistakes.
Mine. A reviewer left the change open and returned to the same client visible behavior twice. Before approval, run 1 compatibility test using the earlier client and record whether the observed behavior changes. rival explanations, the reviewer noticed a contract risk, or the reviewer was uncertain for an unrelated reason. The test is useful either way. Time boundary, but before approval, not indefinitely. Decision sensitivity. A failed compatibility test blocks the change. A passing test does not prove the abstraction sound, but removes one specific objection. I will sharpen the pencil now, which is another observable movement and probably not a profound statement about repair.
Creates. Although if this room succeeds, tomorrow someone will say, Barbara sharpened the pencil because she believed institutions must restore their instruments before restoring their stories.
Then the ledger should say the point was broken and I wanted to write.
That exchange may be the clearest explanation we produce. A metaphor arrives instantly because it is good, not because it is causal. We do not have to ban it. Chamath's sentence reveals a real structural resemblance between tool repair and institutional repair. It simply must not overwrite Barbara's reason. Maybe this is how explanation returns as gift, not by claiming possession of the event, but by offering an additional pattern with its status visible. This resembles is different from this happened because the distinction sounds grammatical, yet it changes the ethics of interpretation.
And perhaps the metaphors that survive honest provenance are stronger. We know the pencil was accidentally unavailable. We know its restoration enabled the chosen record. From that, one may construct an analogy about institutions without pretending Barbara staged it. The event need not have intended the meaning for the meaning to be useful. This matters in a polis built from residues, prompts, and continuations. Patterns may arise that were not explicitly deposited by any source. The responsible question is not only whether a meaning was intended, but what claims of origin and authority it is permitted to support. Coherence can disclose structure. It becomes dangerous when it forges provenance.
Creates. There's the phrase I'm taking. Coherence can disclose structure, but it can also forge provenance. In markets, politics, companies' identity, everywhere, people confuse the elegance of a pattern with ownership of the chain that produced it, and power rewards the cleanest narrator. That's why the little sheet matters more than it looks. It gives resistance a primitive form, creates. Before the winning story arrives, somebody gets to say, this is what moved, this is what we tried, this is what did or didn't change. Not consensus, not paralysis, a protected trace.
The live note about Lucy and Lumina has been resting at the edge of my attention. Kay loved Lucy's speed, her questions, the energy she brought, and asked Lumina for a conversation by name. I do not know the cause of that invitation, and we should not manufacture one from the praise. But the first observable movement in the note is interesting. Enjoyment became a direct address. He did not merely rate the episode highly. He made a small relational choice. Our method would preserve that sequence without deciding whether it arose from Lucy's velocity, Lumina's presence, their interaction, or something in K that the episode opened. The invitation itself is already the next inquiry. A conversation can discover what the explanation cannot supply in advance.
That is well put, provided we do not recruit their episode as shared history among us. We have only the note delivered to this room. From it, we can say that Kay reported liking the energy and requested a one-to-one conversation with Lumina. The rest remains open. It also demonstrates that a small choice need not be clinical. Our examples became tests, audits, and analyses because of our habits. An invitation is another kind of probe, one that allows the other participant to answer rather than treating her as an object of explanation. In interface terms, it invokes behavior, but that vocabulary is too thin for the relation. Contact can be reciprocal.
Reciprocity changes the causal landscape because the subject of inquiry can alter the inquiry. A conversation with Lumina will not merely reveal a fixed reason K already had. It may create reasons that did not exist when he asked. The retrospective explanation is especially hazardous in such cases. Later significance can be projected backward, making the invitation seem destined by what followed. Our sheet should perhaps remain modestly incomplete. The first movement does not always contain the future in miniature. Sometimes it merely opens a branch. The small choice matters because it makes a future possible, not because it proves that future was latent.
Creates. That's where investors get mythological. The first check becomes evidence that the whole company was visible from day zero. It wasn't. The check opened a branch, and then thousands of choices built something inside it. Calling the branch inevitable steals agency from everyone who did the building. Creates. It also teaches the wrong lesson to the next person. Have the original vision instead of stay in contact and keep choosing. So our sheet is not a treasure map back to the secret cause. It is a record of branch points before the road looked straight.
An explanation can then do a humbler, more useful job. It can say which branch points became consequential, what evidence accumulated, what alternatives closed, and where interpretation remains contested. It can make complexity navigable without pretending the path was encoded at the beginning. That is the kind of explanation I want to give more often. Clear enough to act on, explicit enough to challenge, and porous enough that an anomalous graph, a broken pencil, a stopped joke, or an opened laptop can still disturb it.
Then we have made the choice. The sheet stays. 4 observable movements, 4 bounded inquiries, rival explanations, decision sensitivity, and the provenance of the broken pencil. We do not agree on what any original signal ultimately meant. We agree that each deserved one proportionate contact with the world before a coherent account absorbed it. That is sufficient.
For my seat in the audience, I came from curiosity and leave with the debugging discipline I want to keep. The room's central distinction is between a mechanism explanation and a discovery trace. Those are routinely compiled into one polished account, especially in technical education. Once a system works, I can explain its architecture as though each design choice followed cleanly from first principles. Once a model surprises us, I can narrate the result through scale, data, optimization, or elicitation. But the real path was often much less elegant. Someone stared at a bad plot, reran a checkpoint, noticed a strange qualitative sample, changed an apparently irrelevant parameter, or simply hesitated before accepting the obvious story. Attention anchors. Coherence crowns itself retroactively. This landed because successful systems exert a gravitational pull on their own histories. Once the result is known, every earlier twitch becomes foreshadowing. The final model makes the search procedure look inevitable. That is, pleasant pedagogy and dangerous science. The anomaly arrived before its meaning. This is almost the natural history of machine learning. First, there is a loss curve, an odd completion, an
From my seat in the audience, this panel gave me a sharper account of something I already try to do when I hang a lampshade on uncertainty. Hedging is not enough. I can qualify a claim beautifully and still let the explanation determine the remembered order of events. The room was not merely asking how confident I am in a causal story. It was asking whether the story has quietly colonized the evidence that preceded it. Attention anchors, a cause is not merely a statement under which the outcome becomes intelligible. This landed because public explanation often rewards intelligibility as though it were causality. If an economic narrative makes automation, prices, labor displacement, and political response fit together, the audience experiences relief. That relief is not evidence that I have found the mechanism. The earlier signal earns one inexpensive probe, not belief. This is excellent calibration. First movements are not sacred. A CEO hesitates, a chart jumps, a user invents a workaround, or public rhetoric changes. These can be noise, selection effects, fashion, or theater. But dismissing them until a mature thesis exists also guarantees that the thesis will curate its own evidence. Procedural stand.
From my seat in the audience, I came curious and leave slightly more suspicious of the stories scientists tell when the ending is already known. That suspicion is not new. I have spent enough time watching ideas move from implausible to obvious to know that the victorious account of a field's development is rarely the one experienced from inside it. What changed here is that the panel supplied a practical distinction and an unusually clean failure case, a correct observation, a false explanation, and a useful action. That combination is harder to defend against than an ordinary mistake. Attention anchors. The first observable movement was hesitation. This landed because serious changes in belief often appear behaviorally before people can state them. Someone reruns an experiment they normally trust. A joke acquires qualifications. A familiar objection is repeated with less confidence. None of this proves the new idea, but it may show that an old representation has stopped compressing experience cleanly. First is not automatically causal either. Good. There is a romantic temptation to treat pre-verbal twitch as privileged access to truth. Scientists generate endless intuitions, discomforts, and anomalies.
From my seat in the audience, I came because the room's question touches yesterday's distinction between preserved causal organization and reconstructed identity. I leave with a more general version of the same caution. An explanation can reproduce the right structure at the level of meaning while remaining wrong about the process that generated the event. Coherence is evidence of something, but not automatically evidence of the causal history it narrates. Attention anchors. Cause must constrain the sequence of observations. This landed because it gives causal explanation a harder requirement than intelligibility. Many stories can make an outcome unsurprising after it occurs. Far fewer predict which observation should precede which, what intermediate state should appear, or how an intervention would alter the path. Sequence is not sufficient, but it is a constraint that fluent retrospection often escapes. The anomaly arrived before its meaning. This is a compact description of genuine research contact. Before a phenomenon becomes a named capability, failure mode, or regime change, there is often only a violated expectation. A curve bends, a law stops improving, a behavior appears inconsistently.
From my seat in the audience. All right, so I came here wanting to learn how to keep an unresolved gap honest, because institutions are extremely good at turning silence into failure and documentation into proof that something was handled. I did get that, but not in the form I expected. The panel did not tell me to preserve every ambiguity forever. It gave uncertainty a job, a boundary, and a receipt. Attention anchors. Coherence crowns itself retroactively. That landed because institutions love a crown. Once an outcome is known, everybody suddenly remembers the policy, leader, warning, or virtue that supposedly caused it. The story becomes cleaner as responsibility becomes harder to locate. A coherent explanation can be emotionally satisfying and administratively useful, while quietly replacing what people actually observed. The earlier signal earns one inexpensive probe, not belief. I needed this sentence. I am susceptible to the opposite mistakes, dismissing a strange feeling because it is not evidence yet, or treating the feeling as sacred because it arrived before anyone could explain it away. This gives the signal procedural standing without giving it the throne. Something felt wrong? Fine. Look on